dealing with post-45 Rijeka, and I'd asked Brigitte to organize a panel, and of course we couldn't do it live and enjoy it, but hopefully 2021 there'll be a chance for some a chance for us to see each other live in Rijeka or elsewhere. And so, as I said, this class is on digital humanities, and some of the students have been working on their own mapping. Not as maybe sophisticated as the app that this project has created. So I'm looking forward to hear from all of the participants on what we've learned so far. And I've asked them to describe their individual projects, but also working on this digital platform. And I think that's one thing which will stay after Rijeka 2020 is over. And hopefully we'll be able to continue to work on this project and this platform. And I'll be your moderator today. And as moderator, I'm going to take the advantage to actually say a few words about what I've learned about what I've learned so far. And I've often been introduced as a Rijeka historian, but I've never really been a historian of Rijeka until I've really started working on this project. So I've learned a lot about the hidden charms of the city and the complex history. And I've done some archival work because of this project, and worked with all of you on this project and learned through your own research. And I mean, we've all collaborated quite a bit. And I know this was mentioned in Dominique's, your book launch, I guess it was last week or however long ago it was, that there is now this group, and here we are hanging out again. And I think that's such a very cool thing. And of course, it wasn't just with the Rijeka and Flux project that's been going on. We've been building it slowly, but definitely Rijeka and Flux is one of these nodes that we've all gotten to hang out together and learn from each other. And I think it's enriched the study of Rijeka, and it's added this very comparative aspect, interdisciplinary, using all these various tools as historians, geographers, cultural studies specialists, and so on. So I'm really proud and been happy to be part of this group, and I hope we continue these kind of events, Zoom or live. And also the Center for Advanced Studies has brought a lot of people in together, so that's a great aspect. And just a final little pitch. Also, we have this ERC grant with Revenant, hopefully continuing on the work and putting Rijeka into a broader comparative perspective of post empires. So I said I was going to be strict with the time limit, but so I'll move forward, and we'll have our first speaker, and it's Ivan Jelicic, and he'll really discussing this shift from the empire to the post-empire to nation states. And the title of his work has been Late Habsburg Workers and Socialism and Local Transitions from Empire to Nation States. And he's had a chance to present his work with his ERC group, Nepostrans. I've always intimidated by that word, but really looking also at socialism and socialists actually before 45. Usually we look at the partisan point. So Ivan, please tell us what you've learned so far in this project.
Okay, thank you very much, Viera. I also have the time here, so I'll try to stick with the time. Brigitte, will you? Okay.
I will, yes. And then even after you speak, if you don't mind, Viera, if I could just say a few things about the project more broadly.
But maybe Brigitte, you can start. I mean, if you would like to say something more about the project, and then I can jump in.
Is that okay? I don't want to be.
No. You're right. You mentioned that. You mentioned that, and I'd gone off script because I just looked at the list we had.
No problem.
Logical.
Okay. So let me do that. So I'm not going to be too verbose because we're imposing this really strict limit on everybody. So I'm going to try.
Can you put it on the full screen for the PowerPoint?
Oh yeah, let's do that. I find I'm on my laptop and finding it hard to navigate a little bit. But yeah, hopefully, there we go. Okay, so Yeah, this is where we're at the midway point, basically, of the Rijeka in Flux project. And so this is sort of like, for some of us, we will be presenting unfinished research. Other people were postdocs on the project and have sort of wrapped up their work. So this is, and this is in some ways our first opportunity to really get together and share some of our findings and maybe sort of brainstorm about how our projects intersect as we carry on with our research. The main premise behind Rijeka in Flux has been to examine the manifold transformations in the city of Rijeka in the wake of the border change after the Second World War, when the border moved from what is the middle of today's Rijeka. At the time, those were two separate municipalities, but in many ways a continuous built fabric by the time the Second World War rolls around, continuous in the sense of there not being open space between them, not in the sense of being integrated, obviously. And at that point, the border was relocated to the other side of the Istrian Peninsula. And rather than have a single scholar tackle the enormous task of trying to inventory all these different changes, the idea was to have many different scholars examine change from different thematic and also disciplinary perspectives. And another core component of the project was the production of an augmented reality mobile phone app to spatialize and communicate scholarly knowledge about the city. And I put the name of the app on this slide, so you can go and download it and check it out for yourself. Obviously, the augmented reality only works if you are in the Rijeka, but you can be an armchair tourist with this app, so it's really quite fun. Beyond more traditional ways of sharing research, like this roundtable, this is a way to bring our various research agendas together, and in particular to highlight overlaps and intersections. And I've presented this app on other occasions, so it won't be the focus of this presentation, but I welcome questions about it. And also, maybe we can talk about Vieran after our presentations. We can talk about the challenges of taking very complex historical research and translating it into markers on a map. maybe we can address that individually. So that could be something we do. And we're planning an official launch in the spring, so stay tuned. So I don't want to take too much time. But I want to introduce something that also speaks to the potential of the app as a place for integrating research. While we're all pursuing individual research agendas, there's really interesting overlaps between the different projects, namely the role of the Yugoslav Economic Development Project, the role of shifting demographics, and identity politics, and in particular, the use of urban space to express, these politics. So I encourage you to think about that, about these overlaps as we present. And then I would like to hand the floor over to Ivan.
Okay, so thank you very much. I'll try to stick with the time. Maybe you can also go to the next slide. So yeah, just a disclaimer regarding the title. The title Vieran was mentioning, you heard actually what I have been researching for the project. So the most important here element I would say is that I'm based with ERC Nepostrans, so I'm collaborating with this other project while my main research topic is inside ERC Nepostrans. But I have been contributing to this other project basically through my two different topics I'm researching, which are part of the title. One is based on my previous PhD, so on late Habsburg time socialists and workers, and the other right now is on the transition from empire to nation states on a let's say broader Rijeka metropolitan area, whatever this means, and it's still a little complicated topic. So while I was working for one of these markers, which was assigned to me, and this was the Kozala ossuary under the Church of Saint Romuald and All Saints, I basically have been gathering literature regarding this topic. There has been something published. Also, I hope I'll be able to re-elaborate a little bit more, because there are also some interesting findings regarding this ossuary that can, I would say, give another more complicated shade about the process of well, nationalization, nationalistic policies, and so on and so on. But to be brief, inside 8 minutes, the point was that this church tells just one story, and this is the transition story from the Habsburg Empire to Italy. So the people who are buried inside this cemetery are basically people who were Italian soldiers buried in nearby cemeteries nearby Istria and present-day Slovenia. Their bodies have been moved to this crypt. There are also the Nuncio legionnaires, but also those who fought as Italian regulars inside the army during the Christmas of Blood. And there are also other people inside it. But the point is, I mean, it served the purpose of, well, explaining a transition, which should sound as normal, if you want natural, or if you want, I mean, the real transition, which was from the alleged prison of peoples or the prison of nations, the Habsburg monarchy, to the Italian state. And I already see I'm into, yeah, I already have been talking for almost 3 minutes. Okay. Angela, which is here with us, asked me last year, well, could you contribute to our volume Spiegelugen with something which could say more about the memory sites, about a Croatian memory site or about a workers' memory site? And you can go to the next slide. I was thinking about this monument. It's quite an interesting story. What do we know, or what we don't know too much about this monument? So this is a monument which was erected during World War I, and with the end of World War I in Sušak, it was removed. I used it also to address interesting questions regarding, I mean, for instance, when when someone developed interest, a historical interest for this monument. It's interesting. The first mention of it after World War I, as much as I know, is in 1993. So again, it's connected with another transition, or with another new approach in re-identifying or re-asking what is the, if you want, identity of Rijeka or the identity of Sušak. And it's interesting because basically, while you had this story published in 1993 by Sušačka Revija, the idea was seeing this monument as a kind of a local Sušak, Croatian, if you want, monument. Also, I would say as a part of a bourgeois culture, somehow in contrast with the previous Yugoslav socialist working class culture. But during the research I did, and this is, I mean, it's interesting because this is the picture taken from Das Interessante Blatt, so it tells you actually that, I mean, this image circulated not only at the local level, but on the more, let's say, broader, at least Austria, what I would say, the imperial landscape. But the interesting thing is, if you can go, please, Brigitte, on the next slide, is, I mean, that this monument can tell you rather an interesting story about so many layers and problems of Sušak during the interwar period, and the complexity of relations between Fiume and Sušak, but also, I mean, on a general level, about loyalty to the Habsburg monarchy, also about, this is from 1916, if I'm not mistaken. Also, and I mean, since we have time in this regards, I would say, the topic of digital humanities, it's also a rather funny story, I would say, that, so I didn't know that actually this Illustrovani list, which is an illustrated magazine published in Zagreb, has been digitalized partially the first year during the war in Croatia, but all the other years have been digitalized by a Serbian internet base. So this is also another really funny story about who is digitalizing what, when, and for what purpose. I mean, it's really funny that for 1916 and 1917, we don't have this number digitalized by a Croatian institution. For a magazine which was published in Croatia and Slavonia, but it was published by a Serbian institution, which again, I would say, tells you another interesting story about how important World War I is from the Serbian perspective, and how it is less important, or it's believed to be less important in the present day if you want, culture of memory in present-day Croatia. Okay, I still have a few minutes. So the point was that with this monument, it's interesting how we can read this monument in very different ways. So it is generally part, we can maybe go to the next picture. It is important to the next slide. It is important to say, I mean, here that, so this monument was not something specific to Sušak. It was this kind of wooden nailed monument, which was widespread during the war, during the World War I in Austria-Hungary. There is a brilliant article about Kate Dansford regarding this topic. It was also used in Germany. And I mean, it served multiple purposes, among whom, for example, giving the symbolical presence of men in a society where men were at the front, were lacking. So the idea was basically to reinforce and maintain, for instance, a typical male-dominant society through this kind of monuments. And I mean, as I said, I'll try to stick at the time. The point is that this picture, this monument is not simply a local monument. It's a monument which is part of a larger Austro-Hungarian context. It's also a monument that speaks about, I would say, relations between Fiume and Sušak, and about, I mean, how nationalism interpreted in the sense of something against the Habsburg monarchy shows that actually, as Judson brilliantly put it out, nationalism worked inside the Habsburg monarchy and was interconnected empire in this sense with some elements of nationalism. And my time is over. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ivan. That's some serious self-discipline there. And of course, the monuments, it's a great topic. And I had a chance to read this article. And this was one of the examples of what the app is doing, this hidden or forgotten memoryscape throughout the Rijeka, and really, again, showing how many layers there are, not just the post-45 destruction of some of the Italian memorials, but even these earlier periods. And here you have that's King Petar, I think, right, in that image. So this erased memoryscape that used to be there really shows how much is gone. So our next presenter is Gruja Badescu, who's a research fellow at the University of Constance and working on architecture. So it's also been great. Even co-writing an article with Gruja. He has the perception of the architecture, and he's worked on Beirut and on Belgrade before, and so it's great that he's turned his focus also on Rijeka. He was a Center for Advanced Studies fellow here, and I'm glad that it wasn't just a short love affair with Rijeka, but it's continuing on. So Gruja, tell us what you've learned so far from your work.
Well, thank you very much. And actually, I have to first say it is a love story with Rijeka, which I don't think it has an end. So yeah, it's an ongoing one. So I will first take you actually back to December 1945, when there was this article in the Primorski Vjesnik saying that from one of the most modern Adriatic ports, this became just ruins and rubble. So this is the Rijeka at the end of the war, in which Allied bombing, targeting the port infrastructure, the industrial aspects of the city being under German occupation as part of this operations of the Adriatic littoral. So the city lay in ruins, and some years of postal reconstruction followed. And as Vera kindly mentioned, my interest is in postal reconstruction in a number of contexts, and I've been looking at the post-Second World War reconstruction and also within socialist Yugoslavia. So I was very struck by this situation in Rijeka, because it's definitely a very special one, and we have to, please, next slide, and we have to place it into the multiple transformations of the city. So not only that this is a divided city that gets stitched back together, as we see in the image in the down part of the lower part, sorry, but also it's a city that on the one hand you see multiple changes from state, so from Italian Fiume then to an integrated Yugoslav Rijeka, a different system. You have socialism coming. You have also changes in the population profile. You have a majority of the Italians leaving, and the upper picture actually from Tito's visit to Rijeka. So I wanted to, I wanted to bring that a little bit later. But yeah, so we have Italians leaving. We have people coming from various corners from Yugoslavia that Francesca will tell us more about, but also other Italians, like the famous case of Monfalcone Italians, working class coming to Rijeka. So please, next slide. So basically within this context of multiple change, my question was, how does post reconstruction work in such a context in which there's so much going on, and to what extent actually can we place this into these ongoing debates about frontiers? And you have Wendy Pullen discussing from architectural perspective how you have placemaking practices securing the state in contested urban space. So I wanted to probe a bit, to what extent are we talking here in this, let's say, new territory of the Yugoslav state, of any form of intentionality and any form of display of such forms of frontier urbanism? So please, next. So what I did was embark on a journey which is still somehow so halfway. I worked mostly in the archives in Croatia, and I will go also to the Italian ones. Because I will look also in the earlier part of the 40s, but I'm tracing place biographies. I'm interested in architectural histories and also looking at design and interpretations and also intentionality of design, but also tracing these constellations of actors in city making. So who is taking decisions? How do they change? How what are the voices of the local population? And you can see here I'm looking at how they negotiate through war claims, various things with different states, with different state structures, but also which at the local level actually are remarkably showing continuity. They have similar people, but working for under different regimes, at least until 47 or so. So please, next slide. So of course you have some obvious ideas of appropriation of urban space. For instance, we see here the famous Italian interwar skyscraper response to the Yugoslav skyscraper in Sušak, which becomes received this makeover with a star and Tito written. So this is an obvious sign of appropriation. But also what happens is all these urban planning decisions to integrate the regulatory plans of Sušak and of Rijeka into one city, which talks about stitching the city together. Next slide, please. But in terms of dealing with the ruins, what's actually happening are a number of processes. First, there's this very big task of removing rubble. So until 1946, for instance, there are 16,000 cubic meters of rubble being removed. There are about 3,000 buildings being reconstructed, but most of them were actually in parts of the city at its margins in order to house also the incoming workers coming from other parts of Yugoslavia. But as you can see here in this image, this is the images from the old town. This doesn't really receive the same attention, and this actually reflects to a number of continuities. So first of all, we see continuities in, as I mentioned earlier, in the staff that actually takes care of all these files within urban planning and conservation institutes, and which then starts to change in the late 40s. But we see also continuity in a way that places in the city are seen. So the old town is being, the old town is, please go back. Sorry. So the old town is being seen as within this image of the slum, also in the interwar time, but also in the late 1940s. So basically, I found reports in which the buildings in the old town are described as unhygienic, danger of collapse, abandoned and ruined, uninhabitable, even though there are many people living there, unhygienic, in danger of collapse. So what happens is that you have a number of demolitions, not only rubble clearing, but demolitions of still standing inhabited houses throughout the first years of the post-war. And so what we also see is that a lot of the debates taking place and all the reports written are about let's say professional views. So the local authorities and the local planners really mirror what actually happens in other places in Europe, be it in Germany with this obsession of Sanierung, of cleaning up an old city and using reconstruction as an opportunity to clear up. So there's not a lot of discussion of who the population here was, and there were many Italians who actually flee. This is not about that. It's a lot about the perception of the area, which is in terms of what was believed around Europe at the time. And then you have the response from conservationists So the Conservation Institute, for instance, there's this figure of Alexander Perz, who's discussing, and he switches a bit his interpretation of heritage. And at one point he talks about this as being common national good, that the legislation of the People's Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, so this is already in the early 50s, should be, so this is, should be protected in the interest of the people as heritage. So now we can go to the next slide. So while we didn't see any intentionality, we saw basically technical and professional, let's say, frictions between different agents in the reconstruction of the old town, which actually takes place a bit later. So it remains more into the destruction mode. We see intentionality when we talk about destruction of particular obvious markers. For instance, one of the things I was looking at, of course, it's the eagle, and the whole claim of the eagle is removed in early 1949 as a symbol of imperialism. Please, next slide. But what I encountered at one point was this case that became very illustratory of this removal of obvious symbols. So this is another tempio, another votive temple built in the Italian period, but built towards the end. Yes, 1941 begins the collection for what was to be the temple of Christ the Redeemer, which was placed in the exact spot where the Italian army in November of 1918 entered the city. So and you can go to the next slide. So this is designed by Virginio Valot, who is an important architect from Venice, the author of this the Venice train station, who uses a modern language, but also some elements of the past of the Romanesque in particular, in order to talk what he describes this project in Fiume as being a redemption of Italian architecture. But this is being taken as opposed to the one that Ivan just talked about, which remains in the cityscape of Rijeka today. This is the Tempio Votivo in Mlaka was removed, and if you could go to the next slide, it was removed also because this is at the end of the main urban planning intervention that symbolizes the new state, the state that through volunteer work, you have this boulevard of the National Front connecting Cantrida with Mlaka. And if you can go to the last slide, please. So what we see here is first of all, we see that, and this is again ongoing work, but I found that there's not only reconstruction happening in the city, but a lot of actually destruction taking place after the war. And some of them are about political platforms, but a lot of them are about reshaping city visions in let's say the regular technical and professional debates. So probing this concept of frontier urbanism, we see some interventions which are about supporting the ontological security, removing obvious symbols, or building a project like this, this boulevard, this highway that was seen as the triumph of the new socialist system in Rijeka. But we also see that a lot of the debates do not show intentionality in that clear-cut political sense, but they evoke situations in other places in Europe after the Second World War about this conservation versus slum clearance, sanierung. So I look forward to seeing where new material is going to bring me. So, and thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Gruya. I enjoy this idea of frontier urbanism, especially the bird decapitations. I haven't really seen it referred to that, but I'm definitely using bird decapitations in my next description of Rijeka. And our next presenter, Marco Abram, working here with the Osservatorio Balcani, and he's written already quite a bit about Rijeka post-45 and these new images, as we see here, national identities, public spaces. You've already published several articles about it. It looks like you have a few more on the way. We miss having you in Rijeka, so hopefully once the borders open up, you can make it here. And I'm still looking for that hike up in the mountains as well. So I'll definitely make it out there. So Marco, please.
Thank you, Vieren. Thank you, everybody. I'm really happy to be here with all of you today. And yes, I will try to summarize a little bit some of my findings and results of my research work on this topic within the project, and also during my previous postdoc in Rijeka with many of you. So yeah, as my title suggests, my work within, my work has been focused on the transformation of Rijeka and Fiume city's image in the 15 years following the annexation to socialist Yugoslavia. Have a look at the politics of identity promoted by the party, by the new authorities, and by all the other actors that played a role in the socialist political system. I focus my attention on the city's public spaces as disputed spaces, where I try to detect the contradictions, the negotiations, the tensions in the implementation of parties' politics. Of course, the interaction between socialist and national ideologies, but also the role played by daily political needs and circumstances. So next slide, please. And I think that one of the main findings in my research is that Rijeka's new city's image after the war was actually quite fluid. In the first years, I identified two main discourses, two main representations of Rijeka. First, Rijeka as a Croatian city, but also Rijeka as a multinational city. And actually, these two images coexisted and interacted. But in the first years, the multinational image seemed to be stronger, at least at until the very beginning of the 50s. Rijeka was officially presented as a socialist city where different national identities were supposed to be articulated and expressed according to socialist principles. Of course, the Croatian national identity, but also the Slovenian and the Serbian national identities of those smaller communities, and even the Italian identity of those who decided not to leave Rijeka, to stay in Rijeka, and to accept Yugoslavia, to accept socialism, and to be part of the new Italian national minority. However, in practice, things were much more flexible and complicated. Of course, there were disagreements about the correct ways to express national identities in the city, and of course, the expressions of the Italian minorities' identity were kept under a particular scrutiny. But there were disagreements not only between the different parties' levels and agency, but also within in cultural institutions, in national associations, where also many intellectuals and cultural workers who were active before the war and who didn't have a stronger association with the party were still active. So there were, of course, national tensions and clear primordialistic approaches to the national idea, but also different opinions about the role of national identities in a socialist landscape, in a socialist society. Debates that could divide party members regardless to their national background, of course. And what is clear, next, please. Next slide, I'm sorry. Yes, what is clear is that this process could be strongly influenced also by urgent political issues. At the beginning of the 50s, the Trieste crisis and the peak of the confrontation between Yugoslavia and Italy led to an hegemonic affirmation of the second image I mentioned, the one stressing the idea of a Croatian Rijeka. At that moment, Rijeka had to be presented as an unquestionable integral part of the Croatian national territory. And that led to the almost complete marginalization of the Italian minorities culture in Rijeka's public spaces. For example, many streets changed their names, and their visual bilingualism was erased. And but this is how the party dealt with the most recognize national identities in this multicultural urban environment. And there was no recognition, of course, of local or regional identities that, as you all know, were was absolutely present in Rijeka. But then, next slide, please. But then I asked myself, what about the Yugoslav idea? I mean, Rijeka was next to a Yugoslav state, and what kind of role the Yugoslav identity discourse played in this story. As you all know, Yugoslavism was a very fluid and ambivalent idea, especially in the second Yugoslavia, when it was officially considered in supranational terms and fulfilled with the socialist ideology. And it's interesting to note that there were no particular references to a specific Yugoslav identity in the first post-war years in Rijeka. But then in the mid-50s, as everywhere in Yugoslavia, the campaign for a stronger political and cultural integration of the federation started to produce an impact also in Rijeka. And analyzing at the local level the concrete implementation of this campaign, it is very interesting to see how this was understood mainly as the affirmation of the South Slavic identity of the state. And here is just one example, I think, in Rijeka public spaces of that. And of course, a conceptualization of the Yugoslav identity in supranational but exclusively South Slavic terms played an important role, legitimizing those in the party and outside the party that pushed for the complete Croatization of the city's image. Next, please. But at the same time, this definition of the Yugoslav identity produced significant contradictions that eventually seem to have stopped this process of Croatization of the city's image. First, those members of the Italian minority elite who supported the recognition of national rights. Not all of them did, of course. There were also some of the minorities leaders who were perfectly fine with the disappearing of national identities in the socialist society. But those who recognized the role of national identities in socialism started to refer to the conceptualization of Yugoslavia as a multinational socialist federation, asking to preserve minorities' visibilities in Rijeka's public spaces and advocating for a common Yugoslav identity that was inclusive of national minorities' diversities. And this kind of minority issue was not a local issue, because it became a main issue in the party at the federal level, with the anti-centralist faction in the party led by Edvard Kardelj that sided with minorities representatives. So this is a bigger story, and why Rijeka's context is so relevant, in my opinion. The thing is that Rijeka's cultural and political life was still influenced by the border and by border dynamics. So with the improvement of the Yugoslav-Italian relations after 1954, Italian diplomacy became more and more active on minorities issues in the city. The new Italian consul who was settling Koper started to push the Italian culture in Rijeka and to support those minorities leaders who were ready to play the national role. On the other hand, this approach found growing legitimization in the new Yugoslav foreign policy that was developing in those years, presenting self-determination and the right of national minorities as a key aspect in the new system of international relations. So this is how in the city, the minorities culture started to come back. So to conclude, because I think I'm running out of time, Rijeka city's image went through a long transition in the post-war years, a transition that was influenced by the interaction of multiple factors, from ideological factors to very practical political needs. And moreover, I think that it seems that this local history helps to understand wider dynamics. How specific local contexts such as Rijeka could pose political and ideological challenges to the same architecture of the new socialist state. The contention over the new city's image showed how the ambivalences of the new socialist Yugoslav identity produced important contradictions in the politics towards the minority. toward the minorities in general, I would say that helping the process of reform of the Yugoslav political system in the early 60s, and the definition of Yugoslavia, the new definition of official definition, let's say, of Yugoslavia as a self-managed community of nations and nationalities, narodi I narodnosti. And that's more or less in a nutshell what I tried to do in the past years now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marco. And clearly there's still more to be discovered, and this interaction between what is going on the political stage, locally, nationally, transnationally, so these bilateral relations with Italy, and it is then reflected in some of the other things we've talked about, the monuments, the public space, the architecture, and so on, because of course they're all interrelated, and how you rename streets, and who do you choose, and so on, and what is this image. So I think Rijeka is a great example in this. And our next presenter, Francesca Rolandi, who has also been a fellow in the Center for Advanced Studies in Rijeka on several occasions and several postdoc projects. Now she's in Czechia at the Masaryk Institute, and now we're moving a little bit from the physical actual place in Rijeka, in the architecture and the politics, and this migration and settlement dynamics. And Francesca, I owe you some more archival files. I mean to send to you from the Hazu archives. I know you've been trying to get there, so I'll send those to you as soon as I can. But for now, let's hear what you've learned so far from this project.
Okay, thank you, Vieran, and also hello, everybody. I'm very happy that this panel is happening. I think we can start from the second slide, please. Okay, I will start with the title of this presentation, which is from a punk song by the Rijeka band Mrtvi Kanal. And the title is I came to the city from a passive area. And the song continues as following. I chose skyscrapers and refined clothes. I wanted a car, a woman dressed in furs. I wanted to be the best when back home, which is, I guess, a kind of stereotype of the migrant. But if you look at the wider context of the song, you'll see that it tells the story of a newcomer who is living an alienating life, and he feels well just when he's involved in late night brawls. So this song was written in 1983, and it was a time when the city had already experienced the huge migration flows. And I think that this song is able to voice existing frustration and also social inequalities. So what I wanted to do in this project, which is on domestic migration to Rijeka, was to trace this issue on the urban fabric of the city. And I decided in particular to focus on housing, which was one of the aspects which made the differences in living standards more visible. So let's make a step behind. You are probably already familiar with the history of Rijeka. I will just add that as soon as Fiumani, Rieciani opted for Italian citizenship and started living the city, vacancies in workplaces were filled by domestic migrants with different professional backgrounds, ranging from cadres to unskilled workers. What I saw, I mean, this is are my preliminary findings. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to look at all the sources that I had planned to look at. But my feeling is that this resettlement process developed in an unorganized manner, There were thousands of people reaching the city yearly, initially from other areas of Croatia, and later also from other Yugoslav Republic. And for example, Nedeljko Fabrio has recalled this image of newcomers reaching the city on a daily basis. And also the city was not unique in the upper Adriatic area, but maybe what was specific was the fact that the city never looked completely abandoned as other cities, for example, Pula looked like in the post-war years. Please, next slide. And also, if you look at the number of inhabitants, you'll see that it counted 68,000 inhabitants in 1948 and 75,000 in 1953. Which is something impressive if you take into account the massive departure of so many locals. So the city was heavily bombed during the war, but in a short time it managed to rebuild its factories, its port infrastructures, its and only partially its housing stock. But in a very short time, it imposed itself as the most important port of Yugoslavia, and we will hear about that from Brigitte. So what emerged from sources is a chaotic context with many different situations in which I would say that class barriers still mattered. So we can see that while cadres who were much needed were provided with attractive working and living conditions, the thousands of newcomers were accommodated in collective accommodation, which were often warehouses or ruined buildings characterized by very harsh conditions. So in the first post-war years, but also later, there were workers sleeping on bare boards and also providing, for example, in this case, young apprentices with a winter coat was a big challenge. And it's interesting that these unskilled workers relied on companies for anything, from accommodation to board and even clothing. So it didn't take long to the authorities to realize that at the root of what was called the fluctuation of workforce, there was the fact that these unskilled workers were used to move from one workplace to the other in order to look for slightly better living conditions. Next slide, please. And the fact that the lack of a proper housing undermined the relationship between the worker and the state frequently came up in the meetings, for example, as expressed by this officer of the housing office, who say that a man without an apartment, a man without a corner of his own, keeps being apathetic, broken down, unsatisfied, unproductive. So what happened? Our new architectural projects saw the light, especially in the 1950s, when Edo Jardas was the head of the municipality. They succeeded in building a modern city in which the skyscrapers marked the landscape, and they did not just provide the better material conditions, but also irradiated an image of modernity. But however, housing remained a major issue, and authorities proved to be unable to build at the same tempo of emigration. So there was a constant pressure from below, which also led to some interesting forms of negotiation between the authorities and citizens. For example, citizens were staging protests to denounce the fact that they were still waiting to receive a proper accommodation. In the case of this picture, and I have to thank Marco for this, we see a family which moved its furniture to a park as a form of protest. And I also came across other similar cases in which furniture was moved to the street or even to the hallway of the housing office. There were also people squatting empty apartments, and maybe the most visible sign of this chaotic situation were barracks and makeshift accommodations popping up at the margins of the city. Next slide, please. So barracks were provided by the construction companies to accommodate their workers, who in the 1960s were mostly newcomers. And usually they were characterized by very bad living standards. And it's interesting that inequalities were not a taboo, but they were openly discussed by journalists, by politicians, by social workers. And for example, these excerpts, the one on the upper corner, points at the contrast which lied in the fact that the workers building the most modern housing were living in the most primitive conditions. And also you can see this cover from the Italian language bi-weekly Panorama, and I have to thank Ivan for this, which devoted a reportage, an article to the shadows among the skyscrapers. So stressing the fact that the symbols of well-being and appalling poverty were coexisting side by side. And this poverty was epitomized by bunkers, which were squatted by people in need of an accommodation. And there were even people ready to put doors and turning them into makeshift houses. And I suppose that many of you are familiar with Rijeka. There was in the area of Peklin, which was the site of the former border between Italy and Yugoslavia in the interwar period. It was there were several bunkers there, and in the 1950s and the 1960s, these bunkers were repeatedly squatted by newcomers, and as soon as they were evicted, it happened that other people replaced them. So I believe that this image can best illustrate the persistence of harsh living conditions, even in a booming town as Rijeka was. So what I try to show in this very short presentation is that the city was made by city planners, but it was also made by ordinary citizens, and in particular newcomers who outnumbered locals and who literally built the city, and they made it as it was. So they also put some pressure on the authorities to invest more efforts in solving some of the problems. And in particular, newcomers were those more often on the brink of marginalization, and class barriers continued to matter. So access to housing was one of the main issues which somehow set the boundaries between inclusion and exclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesca. And again, moving away from some of the physical materiality that we've been discussing now to other aspects of Rijeka that are maybe more invisible or haven't been discussed. So I think, again, it just shows how important this project, but also the many other Rijeka projects to analyze parts of Rijeka's history and the fabric of the city that we haven't learned about before. So, and also, as Dominique mentioned in the chat, the sharing of, I mean, we've each shared materials, and I think it's again a great moment. I know we're auto celebrating here on this panel, but that's the great part about hanging out. So our next presenter, Vanni D'Alessio, and now based University of Naples. he was my first historian from Rijeka that I learned the ropes from him, and without Vani's help and introduction to the city, I would really be lost. So I mean, I'm glad to have Vani here, taking us to schools and sports clubs. And I mean, we've also formed our own sports clubs, Ultimate Frisbee in Rijeka. So maybe someone will write a dissertation about that.
Well, the name was already interesting because we chose a name to be a little bit, I say, cohesive, integrational. It was Rio Frisbee, so a way to keep the river thing, but you know, easy way. And we used, of course, a two-headed dog that was grabbing a frisbee. That was I don't know where we found it, but it was a great picture. I put on the chat, I don't know if then Brigitte has it somewhere in her presentation, the picture of the Laboratory of Digital History, in Italian LSD, Laboratorio di Storia Digitale, which I do at the University of Naples, because actually my participation to this project also has been mixing the research, education, and so in some way, I think it was also a very interesting work to do for the app, which allowed me to understand better some aspects of Rijeka schooling, and also some other aspects of the Rijeka socialization, because sea resorts, hotel, or the fascist houses or domovi in Croatia were also and the marketplace, of course, were also places of socialization. And my whole research in all these years has been a way to understand these patterns of socialization, integration across different linguistic communities. And you know, to have also students working on the map for so many years and teaching with them and participating in this map through the laboratory and other classes, that also, which is the same thing actually Ivan is doing with the class of multi-language, multinational, or whatever, multi-ethnic cities in modern history at the Faculty of Philosophy of Rijeka, was a way also to understand all this complex reality of Rijeka. Another thing I would like to point out, and I'll see if I can do it very fast also, yes, also in the chat, and I will put a link there, is the YouTube channel of the Italian community of Rijeka, because as part of this research Rijeka in Flux, I participated to a project which is about making interviews to old people in Rijeka of the Italian community. And this also helped me, but also Angelo, which is part of he's doing a PhD on Rijeka at the University of British Columbia, and started with Brigitte, and you know, who's transcribing these interviews, and we are actually using this also for the map and for the research, and helped me all to understand many things and many levels of the history of schooling and other places in Rijeka. But now let's go to the one little aspect I'm going to talk about, which is now schooling, sport, I'm sorry. So you can go to the second picture, Brigitte, yes. The second, of course, this very complex reality is very hard to represent, because representation in map was a constant aspect and preoccupation in working at the same time with different kind of projects, included the map and the app. So you see here the different kind of some clubs, but also the different kind of institutional realities which were connected to Rijeka, and how they interacted with the space, because you see, for instance, you see the Istria, Fiume, and Sushak in Habsburg times, and different kind of occupation, and also to explain the different moments, which I will not go through in the transition of Rijeka history, and how these sport clubs represented a moment in the history and how they tried to represent themselves in terms of the names, of the colors they were using. It's been an interesting. Let's go to the next slide now. So, and this is clear also for the way to understand different multiple realities of Rijeka can be seen through sport also in this way. This is from two different newspapers in which the same firm is selling different kind of products, including footballs, very Inglesi, but you see that it's also prave engleske lopte za nogomet, football, and you know, that says a lot about how Rijeka, not just Rijeka and Sushab, but the same Rijeka was a place of different people as buyers, consumers, and readers. Let's go to the next slide. This is, of course, in Habsburg times. And here about the transition, I know that it's already known by many, but I'm working on this also to understand how the things can be presented in different audiences. But here you see a particular spot, which is the stadium, how in Habsburg times was actually not located in Rijeka, was located in Istria, because it was Kantrid as part of Zamet, as part of Kastav. And it, nonetheless, it was a court, a football court, which was built by the club Victoria from Sushak. And the whole story, it's already known, but it's quite interesting how they came to build that place and how they had to ask different kind of permits from this Kastav municipality, but also from the firm, which was a Hungarian firm with a German name, which was represented by a Serb businessman in Rijeka, and whose nephew was actually to be a very famous Serbian writer, which was at that time at the Sushak school, gymnasium, but at the same time he was living in Rijeka. So, you know, all this situation can be represented very well in this, with these examples. And the same stadium, of course, was the place where for the first time the Italian cockard, the Italian symbol, appeared on a shirt representing Italy. Of course, it's interesting how in those times the team which was using it, which was the team of, let's say, of the legionaries, of the fighters for the Nuncio, against the representation of the two local teams, Olimpia and Angoria, or actually Fiume. They were this team from the Italian, on the Italian side, fighting for the Nuncio, were actually in those moments a very strong opponents of the Italian politics. So the first time that cockard was used was a moment of say opposition and deviation from the state of Italy in those times. Then the stadium became a place as other stadiums in Italy to promote fascism. It was built more as a stadium than a court, as a Stadio Comunale dell'Ittorio in the middle of the 20s. We can see the next slide. And here, of course, you have another example in which transition can be explained and narrated, because after World War II, the team that replaced not really the Fiumana, but actually the Magazzini Generali, which was a decent team in Rijeka in the end, well, at the beginning of the 40s, end of the 30s. And actually this team, or the players of this team, were used to transfer to the new team, which was called Quarnero Quarner. You see the symbol on the left. This symbol slowly changed in use, not really officially. So you see from Quarnero Quarner goes to just to Quarner with the Q. Quarnero, which is the Italian part of it, was, you know, lost. And on the new team of Rijeka, of course, 1954, there is a new approach to the city, which, because the city, it has become already a Croatian Yugoslav city. So it actually can be already identified with something Croatian or Yugoslav. There is no need anyway to this bilingual way to represent the city. But you see the same symbol of Quarnero and Rijeka is still there, which is the symbol. What are the symbols? The mountain and the sea, you know, and this is the new way in which Rijeka can can actually encompass the ambience, while the old Fiume hardly represented a place in which the ambience could be included. And then you have, of course, the Rijeka with the new symbols here on the right side, or the Hanka Rijeka or MK Rijeka, which actually is only a little part of the eagle, but this is another story, we cannot tell it now. And then you have Orient, we cannot tell the story. We can go to the last slide, because yes, another way in which you can study Rijeka, looking at the visual aspect and the representation, is of course, and also how to study the different interconnection of languages and how Italian languages comes back as a legacy or as a remain, is the use, of course, of the graffiti and of the Forza Fiume. And you see in the middle there is the very famous first use in middle of 1980s, with the strong influence which Francesca has been studying in general from Italian pop culture. You can also say a little bit of it with the football, and this Forza Fiume, which still is used from supporters without really making a strong politics of it. But this helped the name Fiume, if you can put it this way, to be used freely from the end of the 80s, when it was really used just for the Italian minority in a very narrow way. There was no real legitimation of the name Fiume in general. For instance, even the touristic guides and the other pamphlets which are used usually would use in Italian language Rijeka. So you can think of it how then Fiume becomes, a different way to represent the city, and also going back to the old legacy. And for this, I will finish because I already took too much time. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanni. And I've been also following a lot of your work on the football scene, and actually the semiotic landscapes that are resulting from it, and all this the ultras and the graffiti and the tagging. So very dense amount of work here. I think it's great. And we'll finish up then with Brigitte. So the alpha and omega of this project, and she's managed to gather a lot of scholars here with her ideas and her project and the mapping, and now this app. And she's, as we heard earlier, a recent migrant from the wilds of Western Canada to Maastricht. So, Brigitte.
Thank you. And I just want to note that I did not instruct Vieren to refer to me as the alpha and the omega, but I'll take it in any context. So yeah, let me jump straight into my research here. So I'm interested in how the relocation of the border embedded Rijeka not only in a different territory with a different hinterland, within a different economic system, both in terms of the rules governing it and the groups and places that participated in the economy, but also I'm interested in how it was embedded in different networks beyond the territorial state as a result of the border change, and how those linkages transform the city. And of course, it's also possible to think beyond the city and ask how these linkages then connected with territorially based networks within Yugoslavia. But for now, I'm primarily interested in how the city itself becomes a kind of node in a global network through its maritime activities, and what consequences this has for the city. So one consequence is obvious, and that's the expansion of the port infrastructure. And thinking in terms of port investments and labor expansion is obviously very interesting, excuse me, but I'm taking a different approach, focusing on practices to see what they reveal about Rijeka's relationship to different actors on the global stage, and then how it leverages these relationships to enhance its status within Yugoslavia. So given my interest in maritime activities, I decided to focus on Jugolinia, which was Yugoslavia's largest shipping line, which operated out of Rijeka. And my sources are the archives of the Maritime Ministry in Belgrade up till 1953 or so, and Ugolinia's own archives, specifically the minutes of its administration and of its workers' council, and some samples of personnel documentation. And I've collected materials up until the mid-1960s, but until now I've looked up until the late 1950s and up till about 1960. So when thinking about flows, we can divide them into 4 categories: goods, people, capital, and information. It might be a bit of an arbitrary distinction, but it's at least the sort of framework I'm working with for now. Although goods are in some ways the most obvious flow, and they're the bread and butter of the shipping industry, obviously, and I could say some interesting things, particularly about illicit flows of goods, that is smuggling. I'm going to focus on the other 3 as they're the most interesting in terms of the findings that I've had so far. Oh, yeah, and of course, since I'm the slide person, I'm neglecting to actually move my slides along. There's my central research questions and a wonderful picture of, you know, how Ugolinia comes to be the symbol of Yugoslavia's sort of making it on the global stage, you know, through representations like this one, excuse me, of one of its cargo ships arriving in the port of New York. This one's for you, Dominique. So let's talk first about networks before we get into the different kinds of flows. And I guess the main takeaway here is that geopolitics shaped maritime policy, and in turn, this shaped Yugoslavia's global linkages. So Yugoslavia had a clear understanding that the merchant marine was an essential tool for pursuing commercial relations, and that as it stood at the end of the Second World War, the merchant marine was in the hands of global powers, and in particular, the British and increasingly the Americans. And these global powers imposed their hegemony through the use of shipping cartels, which they controlled. And then, of course, there were lesser actors, like the Germans were very active in the shipping cartels and in the shipping industry. In the immediate post-war, the Maritime Ministry needed to decide, did it want to approach maritime shipping as a vehicle for exchanging goods with Eastern Bloc states, in line with the emerging logic of Comecon and the Soviet bloc, or did it want to participate in a global market with a view to earning foreign currency? Publicly, it challenged the imperialistic hegemony and proposed reconstituting the global shipping order on equal terms. And what's interesting about this is already at this point, it's adopting a discourse that is in line with discourse coming out of decolonizing states in the global south. So we can sort of see this as prefiguring some of the common interests that are going to inform the non-aligned movement. The Tito-Stalin split transformed the context in which Yugoslavia operated. Suddenly it found itself in the position that it had to trade with states outside the Eastern Bloc. And it opted to invest into extensive industrial development and accumulated as a result significant foreign currency deficits. So it shifted in consequence its line from principled posturing against the global shipping field towards active and enthusiastic participation in it. And it sought to position itself quite ambitiously as a significant node in global transportation. And you can see that in this image here. This advertisement from this advertisement from the Austrian transportation journal Verkehr that states the port of Rijeka is the open door to Central Europe to all directions and in all directions. And in addition to investing heavily into growing its shipping fleet, it sought to expand its geographical reach. By 1950, Ugolinia had 6 regular lines, some of which were weekly, and others bi-monthly or monthly. And it went to Northern Europe, Turkey and Greece, Israel, North America, and the Near East being its most frequent line. Over the next decade, it would expand its coverage to the Mexican Gulf Coast, the Indian subcontinent, Iraq, Iran, China, and Japan. And here we can see a kind of continuity with this early post-war orientation of reaching out to the global south. You can see a nice little image there from an exhibit in Bombay, sort of highlighting Yugoslavia as a business partner for moving goods in and out of India. So now let's look at flows of people and information in terms of what I've been able to find out so far. So shipping lines facilitate the large-scale movement of people. Prior to Yugoslavia's liberalization of the border in the mid-1960s, this made it one of the few ways that people could see the world. People who wanted to leave Yugoslavia could see the world. And a lot of Yugoslavia's employees sailed around the world. Now, obviously, the crews did so, and this is a pre-containerization industry. So the crews were much larger than they are with container ships. They operated the ship and they took part in loading and unloading of the goods. And they got to see the world. This could result in one-way flows. So a kind of anecdotal or rather not super scientific perusal of personnel cards suggests that roughly 10% of personnel deserted in foreign ports. And my graduate student, Oriane Edwards, is working on a database model that will allow us to explore this a little bit more. But flows of employees could also lead to flows of information. And one of my questions is, what kind of knowledge of the world did crews bring home and other employees bring home? So crews interacted with port workers and their ports of call. I see this potentially as being kind of a fleeting kind of contact and often antagonistic due to questions of liability for damage and theft. So for example, in 1955, ship crews complain about dishonest watchmen and thieving Arabs in the port of Latakia in Syria. And one wonders to what extent stereotypes about Arabs, in fact, are playing into this, this narrative. But they were also allowed off the ship for at least a day, often 2 or 3. Again, we're in the pre-container age when loading ships and unloading ships was a complex process. But the archival record is unfortunately silent regarding these kinds of interactions. Social media posts on the Yugoslavia, souvenir Facebook page suggests that this was one of the most memorable aspects of working for Yugoslavia. And so it might be worthwhile to pursue this a line of inquiry through oral history, but that's something that I'll have to leave for now. A lot of other people also traveled on behalf of Yugoslavia. In the second half of 1961, for example, 40 employees went on a total of 85 business trips to locations around the world. They were primarily managers and other kinds of white-collar workers in the company administration, such as the director and his assistant, the director of finance, the shop director, the head of new shipbuilding, who went to visit different places where ships were being built, commercial inspectors, technical inspectors, representatives to different places, including Beirut, Buenos Aires, Casablanca, Genoa, New York, and Singapore, accounting auditors, line officers, and lawyers. So I'm hypothesizing that these business trips, which ranged from a few days to several weeks, allowed a range of Yugoslavia employees to develop an in-depth knowledge, not only of maritime business, but also politics and economic opportunities around the world. And the fact that they would go on such long trips raises the question of whether they also develop long-term friendships and acquaintances, and what kinds of understandings about the world might have continued to flow through these relationships. Another flow that I mentioned was capital. Yugoslavia operated at the intersection of a state socialist economy and the global market economy. While its subjection to Yugoslav administrative barriers put it in some ways in a disadvantageous situation, compared to other shipping lines, and which meant that it lost some business as a result of that. its ability to earn foreign currency placed it in an advantageous position within Yugoslavia. So to illustrate the first example, Yugoslavia controlled how much of its foreign currency earnings Jugolinja could keep, which was a problem if you're in the shipping industry, because most of the company's expenses, such as fuel, docking fees, insurance, bills of credit, etc., were done in foreign currency. So this limited their access to, basic operational activities. For a long time, Jugolinja was not allowed to keep even as much of its foreign currency as import-export firms. So it was subjected to more restrictive policies. And so as a result of this, it seemed to lose its competitive edge on a number of occasions and lost business due to this limitation. Interestingly, and I really would like to dig more into this, it seems to have been exceptionally successful at adapting to these constraints and successfully identified markets in which it could be competitive and managed to acquire market share. And I'm interested in looking at how it selected those routes and succeeded in asserting itself going forward. On the other hand, illustrating my second point about it being in an advantageous position within Yugoslavia, Ugolini had a really important role to play. So obviously it had a role in developing Yugoslav trade. That was one of its explicit sort of missions, to develop Yugoslav foreign trade. It also played a more covert role in foreign policy, for example, smuggling weapons to Algeria. But most importantly was its role in bringing in foreign currency. And that seems to have given it a place at the decision-making table on a number of occasions. And on the top right-hand side of this slide, you can see Radivoj Kesic, who was a director of the company during these important formative years. He made frequent trips to Belgrade, meeting with ministers, the head of the National Bank, making cases for changing policies and developing new policies. And so Ugolini was really one of Yugoslavia's important firms. Now this requires more investigation. As I've hinted above, Ugolini was not always in a favorable position in terms of policies. And at the same time, it seems to somehow have thrived in spite of this. And I suspect that there were ways in which it was compensated for being on the losing side of certain policies, but I need to look deeper into this. So while much of what I've discussed today relates specifically to Ugolini, I think it's easy to see some of the implications for Rijeka. Rijeka's strategic role as a port in the post-war period made it a place through which there was a significant flow of goods, people, blue and white collar, again, hinting at sort of migration into the city from other places, while most sailors came from Dalmatia. And the white collar workforce was significantly more diverse and came from various places in Yugoslavia. Flows of information, global expertise, as well as cultural exchange potentially, and capital, foreign currency flows. And these flows connected Rijeka to places around the world. And most interesting, not just to North America and Europe, but also to the global South. And I look forward to digging deeper into how these flows left traces in the city. Thank you.
Thank you, Brigitte. And in the presentation of Igor Duda's project on Wednesday, the micro-socialism, there's also one of his team members is working on Čakovec and Međimurje and the companies there. So I think this is also a great area to investigate these companies that were under socialism, but at many times functioned as capitalist organizations, but then also engaged in part of Yugoslavia's foreign policy. And there was a message in the chat from Nicolina about some other archival sources about Ugolini. So thank you for that. And we've seen that this project, and of course all the other associated projects, we've collected so much material, and I think one of the big challenges is not just which journal to publish it in, or getting that book contract, but also how do we disseminate some of this information? And again, this is going back to the idea of the digital tools and the map and a lot of the public outreach we were hoping to do and hopefully will continue to do. So we discussed this a little bit in an earlier webinar roundtable we had with Francesca earlier last year in the public history and doing public history. I thought that was also very interesting, using museums and exhibitions and so on to share a lot of this great wealth of information that we have. So hopefully we'll be moving forward and continue to develop this. So there is already Journal of Modern History, firmly wedged in the ivory tower. But again, that's a challenge for us as scholars and historians and the other humanities, is to bridge that gap of publishing in the academic journals, but also reaching out. So I know that Dominique had an early question for Ivan. I don't know if anyone else has questions. Maybe just write it in the chat or raise your hand. And I think technically the class is over, but I think we should definitely continue to have a discussion. As long as people endure. We've got the time. So let's.
I don't have a question for Ivan. I always have questions for Ivan, but we don't have to do that together. I have a question for Gluya. Gluya, I'm really interested in how you're approaching this in terms of border. I was just in Livorno, as I think you know, and I was thinking about, I forgot the woman's name who gave that really interesting talk on Zadar at our conference last year. But I'm wondering about these towns bombed to smithereens in the middle of rebuilding, using this opportunity to destroy as much as to create, which is, I love that point. I think that's incredibly useful. But I'm wondering if this emphasis on border is really necessary as much as you seem to be putting it there, because Zadar is not a border town, Livorno is not a border town, but you do see the same kind of forces of destruction and construction around ideology, not just around, so Livorno, the communist city, is getting destroyed and rebuilt, and I don't see a lot of let's be part of Marx's world in Republican Italy in the 1950s. So I just was wondering, is this emphasis on border the key? And does looking at places like Livorno and Zadar change our understanding of Rijeka? Or I'd love to hear more.
Thank you very much. So actually, I didn't dwell too much into this now, but there's this distinction done in spatial studies, like I think geography or in architecture more recently, between talking about border and borderlands and frontiers. And of course, frontiers also have a rather large historiography with a sense of opportunity, but also a sense of the militariness of this. But frontiers are understood when looking at space as somehow different from borders. Borders are, let's say, this institutionalized territorial limits. Frontiers are conceptual places in which states consolidate, in which states expand. Either you can talk about the frontier attitude of people settling in, so it also comes from different spatial agents, like Francesca's actors, for instance. They also settle the frontier, but states deal with frontiers as places that they consolidate. So in fact, Zadar is also a place that they consolidate, despite that being rather deep in the territory, but also it's about border change. So border change, but I'm less interested in the border change as in this idea of the frontier. So, and I look at these, this also in dialogue, I didn't talk about it today, with other situations of post-reconstruction, which of course you talk about different reappropriations of heritage. Many things are happening after a regime, change, because it's not only about state change, but regime change. But in this case, I'm interested in what are the mechanisms and to what extent actually are we imposing that mechanism. This is why what I was looking into, and I paid a lot of attention to what do these actors say, and what the language of both planners and conservationists that I found, it matches very much what happens in places that don't change any regime and any frontier. However, there are other acts that show that. So I'm trying to see what is the balance and what is the what are the frictions between these interpretations. So that, because also another question here when we talk about architectural change is, to what extent do we, what does it matter more, the intentionality or the consequence of an act? Because when you remove something for a completely different reason, this can be read by various groups or various individuals in different ways. So, but I wanted to look at the intentionality, at least the stated one that I could find. And also it's very interesting, and I didn't have enough time now to talk about, but also the agency of people. How, for instance, you have this idea of continuity and ruptures. People who are negotiating with different regimes, saying the same things about their bombed house. First, they send it to the Italian administration. Then you have the so basically you have the Nazi Germany taking over. Then you have. But then they write, and the same people receive the documents, and they even use the same forms, and they just put different stamps. And so it's very interesting to see how the local, and it really very much echoes what you are showing in your book about the aftermath of the First World War. So I see this trait. The local is also a powerful way of looking beyond the state intentionality of frontiers. So yeah, I hope this plays it. Thank you.
Are there any other questions or follow-ups to that answer, or some other presentations? Olga, okay.
Yes. Hi, everybody, and let me tell you how wonderful it is to see you again and all the familiar faces. And I almost feel the heat of that day in Rijeka coming through my computer, even though we're in the virtual space. So great. Yeah, Brigitte, congratulations, and everybody on the team, congratulations with excellent work, and thanks for inviting me to this seminar. I have two questions to city urban people on the team. And one relates to difficult choices that states and municipalities often had to make when deciding what to keep, what to rebuild, what to bomb, erase, and how. Budgets were tiny, states were poor, money was not there. And I wonder if you looked into this question of what happened when they simply didn't have resources for destroying and rebuilding, and how authorities but also people dealt with this. And the second question was in regard with housing distribution. How was it made, and whether there were any clear lines of preference, especially whether or not people who were employed in so-called strategically important enterprises would have priority, and how was that actually justified in the context of, socialist equality of everyone and everybody? So these are my questions. And again, thanks a lot for a fantastic, fantastic presentation.
Who wants to tackle those questions?
I can talk about the first one, but I guess maybe to change if Francesco wants to call the second one first, and yeah.
Okay, it's the same. I can go first. Thank you very much, Olga, for this interesting question. I have to say that I don't have answers to all the questions which I came across in my research. Actually, I started my research project in February 2020, and I finished it in December 2020. So it was not a very good time for doing field research, but still, yes, housing distribution. I could recognize some patterns. One relates to the class barriers, which I mentioned, which means that for sure cadres were more likely to have a smooth access to housing because there was a policy of attracting cadres who were much needed. It depended on the firms because there were some firms who were which were more active in building projects, and I wouldn't say that the kind of enterprise was so determinant in access to housing, because, for example, there were very strategic factories such as the shipyard, the 3rd of May, in which there were huge problems regarding access to housing still in the 1960s. So I think that the situation was very diverse, and it was justified in different, as much as I have seen, in different ways. So there was always a discourse, like a kind of self-criticism, like we are not doing enough. But on the other hand, the justification, as you said, was put on money and the lack of resources. So yeah, I think that there would be many possible answers, but thank you very much for raising this question.
Maybe I can follow up on the question of the funding, and of course we're working with we're thinking about places that are really struggling from a point of view of budget. So what's interesting, I will maybe refer to two things. The first one is how this idea of the war damage claims. So so both in the Italian time, but then also later, people are required actually to send claims, and this actually is about this idea of asking for reparations later. And this happened already after the First World War. We can see this in the French case. France did that after with the Northeast destroyed by German forces, thinking that that if everyone gets all the money, then the Germans will pay. But actually, it didn't happen. And the same happens here. Actually, now I'm trying to see what actually happened with those claims, which kept being sent to different administrations. But basically, what happens in the way that different now, if you look at the newspapers of the time in different periods, you have this idea of money being sent, money being allocated, how actually there's sacrifice through money being invested. But there's an emphasis, particularly after 1947, on this idea of volunteer, of you come and take part in the clearing of ruins. You, the građani, you take part in the volunteer project of building this National Front highway. And there's a lot of emphasis on this and how people are participating in it. It doesn't underline that there's a lack of money, but they talk about the sacrifice to build this new society. So it's a combination of but then at one point, actually, what's interesting is that it doesn't really work. Not all, with all these calls for volunteers, the highway is not ready until they send the army. So the army helps, and they actually finish the construction. So it's not really so yeah. But this idea of labor as kind of helping out with the lack of funds. Yeah.
Okay, do we have some other some comments?
Well, if I may, I think it would be also, it's quite interesting. I mean, this is also the reason why I referenced this book. I mean, to see it in the long run, how these things change. I mean, from the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, if you want, until the present days also. I mean, this kind of, well, lack of money regarding, you know, urban planning, and also how this kind of some facilities change importance or do not change importance during the time. I mean, in time of bigger shifts, 90s, 1918, or if you want 1924 also for Rijeka, 1945. So there are very interesting, I mean, cases like Francesco was mentioning the shipyard Treći Maj, but also, I mean, torpedo factory workers are, I would say, are quite a fascinating story. I mean, in the sense that you have a bunch of workers who have, because of the owner of the factory in the late Habsburg period, a specific neighborhood for themselves, which then lasts, I think, until the end of World War II. After that is bombed. It would be interesting also to follow up what happens to some of these people. I know, and this is another, again, fascinating story. I have been talking with Dominic to this. I mean, the torpedo factory actually changes its headquarters to Livorno. So it will be interesting to see this kind of connection between Livorno and Rijeka in this period, and also, I mean, the resettling of people and, I mean, urban planning infrastructures and so on.
If I can just add something. Yeah, about the lack of money is also in my research. It was always challenging because, of course, in the cultural politics, in identity politics, there was always the issue of money. We cannot really afford to have I don't know, 3 different cultural institutions for 3 different national communities. So for me, it was always difficult to understand if it was just an excuse or a real problem. And of course it was in many cases. And I think that the main example is the issue of the theater. The theater was from the beginning presented and organized as a binational theater with both Italian and Croatian drama sections, has to say. And at one point they start to debate the need to keep the Italian one because of lack of money, because, you know, it was after the coming for split and all, and I mean the self-management in theaters was really challenging. The existence of theaters everywhere in Yugoslavia, so also in Rijeka. But yeah, the impression is that so these are real problems, but of course at one point there is a political decision also in these issues. So if you have different, at one point, in the example of the theater, all the Croatian intelligentsia is pushing and pressing so much for having all the resources allocated to the Croatian section of the theater that at one point the party, after 4 years of negotiation, decided to close down, to close the Italian section. But then at that point, something happened at the higher level, and Belgrade said that the Italian section had to be saved, and they allocated more money for the theater. So I mean, I think it's difficult to understand sometimes, but it is always an interaction between the two factors, the material factor and the ideological.
I can just jump in.
Yes, I can also jump in. Can I jump in? Because I raised the hand. Okay, because it's very fast. It's probably you'll be heading towards much more complex questions. I just want to have an add on Marcos. I mean, we all know how the interaction between the Trieste question and all what Marco was saying is crucial. And of course, it's not just about resources. For instance, in the problem of identification and fixing who was what and how this was important for sport and schools. I mentioned before, the Quarnero becoming Rijeka in '53, but also in the same period, there was the effort from the Ministry of Schools in Zagreb, which was actually a so-called Circolare Peruško from a professor of the Italian high school in Rijeka, Tony Peruško, and he actually asked to all the schools in not only in Rijeka but also in Istria to make lists of Croats, Italians, and dubious people. Of course, where the places were not like in Labin, in many Italian schools, there were people who actually said that there were some Croats there, actually 150. And, in a couple of days when this decision was made, all these 150 Croats were transferred from one day to the other to the Croatian schools. even though they actually didn't know very well Croatian. And the strategy at that point was, of course, not to rely on the Italian community, on the Italian Union, because it was already too much controlled. But somehow the schools started to put, like the Italian high school and the elementary schools, that they were almost non-Croatian, non-Dubious, which is kind of weird if you see all the surnames of the kids and how, how much it was interacted, the two kind of cultural identities or linguistic identities of origins or whatever. And so, I mean, and this doesn't really happen because of a problem of resource. Okay, Brigitte.
I put my hand up too this time. This discussion around that Marco raised about, funding, if you want, or whether there was enough funding, enough money to pay for different things. Of course, particularly in this period, and this is a kind of a classical state socialist economy where money is a fiction, right? That represents the priorities of the states and how it decides to allocate them. And so I think we have to always ask, we always have to sort of scrutinize statements about whether there was enough money for something or not. I mean, not that there weren't objective shortages of things, but I mean, and here it kind of also bifurcates because the arts were always underfunded. In fact, during the presentation in the micro-socialism panel, we heard about the underfunding of culture, how cultural workers always made less than workers in any other sector of the economy. So the arts in general are not valorized within this economic model. But then obviously it strikes me that the politics of the situation are the deciding, sort of push things over the edge. And I'm reminded about how departments are shut down in academia. Oh, we don't have enough funding to run the classics department or whatever. It's in the end all about funding models, and those can be manipulated in any number of ways. And somehow they're always justified as kind of objective, incontrovertible, obstacles that we don't find a way around, and yet there are ways to find ways around it, right? So that's one thing that I wanted to say. On a different topic, it was very interesting to me taking down notes while listening to the talks about interesting intersections of different contributions. One of them that I picked on is this idea of the border and how the border in some places is symbolic and important. Gruya spoke to that. And in other places like Pechlin, the border is invisible, right? It's a non-place in which, informal housing is allowed to sprout. And so I find that very interesting how the border doesn't have the same valence everywhere. Something else that I thought was really interesting was the question of the integration and or non-integration of the two parts of the city, and how even, as Ivan mentioned, and how Vani mentioned, there's already all this interesting stuff going across the border and connections and linkages prior to the relocation of the border. So I thought that was really kind of interesting in relation, again, to this notion or this kind of rhetoric and discourse of uniting the two halves of the city that had been artificially separated. But it sounds like there was a lot going on there already, and I wonder how that was reconfigured, or were there continuities? Were there what exactly to what extent were those already existing linkages? Did they persist into the post-war? And I also thought, this intersection of modernization projects, like Gruya mentioned, the Sanierung project, that's a modernization project, as is building up the economy in a particular way and bringing in people from all over Yugoslavia and integrating them. Although, as Francesca mentioned, clearly it wasn't important enough to actually invest in housing. So we have that on the one hand, and then we have the whole question of identity politics and how those two things intersect with one another. And I think that's a really interesting nexus as well. So I just thought it's not really a question, it's more a series of observations. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on it.
Do we have any more comments about the nexus and the intersections, or anything else that we've mentioned?
Okay, maybe if I may jump in, I I wanted to build on Brigitte's comment. Thank you very much for raising this point. I think that since we are dealing with borders, it's important to stress that not all the borders have the same meaning. Because, for example, as you said, the border, the Delta border, so the border on the River Rijeka represented the competition between two states, basically, while other borders were, the traces of other borders were neglected because it was much harder to make sense of them. And Pechlin is one of such cases because it crosses what was a rural area after the war. So how to include, or which actors really wanted to include that that area?
I saw there's also, I mean, comments about some of these other cities, and I propose once the pandemic calms down, which hopefully we get like some kind of bus, and we take the Rijeka show on the road. You know, everyone's got their books and pamphlets and off prints, and we've got our slides, and you know, I'm sure they want to hear us in Belgrade and in Marseille and elsewhere. So looking forward to the party, the Rijeka party bus. You know, I think we've yeah, Rijeka Caravan. Even have our own band, sure. You know, I think we've reached the end of the session, and it's time for the. I've ordered the catering to arrive from Konaba Blato, so that's going to be a moment to relax over some wine and.
I'm
On
waiting
your
for
own
it.
house.
Yes, yes.
Anyway, thank you so much, everyone, for sharing the information, and it's always great hanging out with you, and every time learning more, even though, again, we've been exchanging information and materials. It's like each presentation, there's something new to learn, and I'm sure there'll be some more events that you'll be organizing. So the mantle is to you guys. You guys organize the next ones.
That's right. So first I wanted to thank Vieran for hosting us and for sort of giving us the momentum to do this in spite of the pandemic. You know, when the pandemic happened, I felt like everything was just sinking to the bottom of the Adriatic. And it was nice to have a kind of, you know, somebody sort of pushing us ahead in the context of Memoryscape. So thank you for that. Thanks to everyone for coming out. And I feel like, yeah, there's still plenty to research and still plenty to talk about. And so, of course, the project funding continues for another, you know, a year, almost a year and a half. And we can think of ways, you know, for those of you who need to do more research, once it becomes possible to travel, we might be able to find some funding for that. And we have the launch of the app will be coming up in the spring, still details still to be defined, but also I'm really hoping we can have a closing workshop at some point in 2021 as well. So closer to the second half of the year. So stay tuned, and thank you also to everyone who came to listen to us. And I hope you'll continue to follow our research, and we would love to talk to you some more as well.
Great. Okay. See you all next time. Ciao.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Ciao.